If an Australian ASLAV rolled into a modern battlefield tomorrow, the real question is not how powerful it is, but how long it could remain relevant before the battlefield itself turns against it. This is not a theoretical debate because the ASLAV is not a museum piece. It is still part of the Australian Army's operational ecosystem, a wheeled 8x8 reconnaissance vehicle with a 25mm cannon capable of speeds around 100 kilometers per hour and a range of roughly 600 kilometers, originally designed for mobility, situational awareness, and rapid response across wide terrain. For decades, it represented a balance between firepower, protection, and speed that suited Australia's expeditionary operations, from peacekeeping to coalition deployments. But the strategic environment that shaped that design has changed faster than the platform itself. Today, Australia's defense planning is anchored in the 2024 National Defense Strategy, which shifts the focus from a broadly balanced force to a more integrated and focused posture aimed at denying potential adversaries the ability to project power toward Australia's northern approaches and critical sea lanes. And that shift forces a harder question onto every legacy platform still in service. Not whether it once performed well, but whether it fits the kind of war Australia is preparing for. Now, the uncomfortable truth is that the modern battlefield is no longer defined by who has the thicker armor alone, but by who can see first, decide faster, and act across a network of sensors, communications, and precision effects. And in that environment, even a fast and reliable vehicle like the ASLAV faces a new kind of pressure, not from a single threat, but from a system of threats that compress time and space on the battlefield. Yet here is the critical twist that makes this story far more complex than a simple verdict of outdated versus modern. The Australian Army has not retired the ASLAV overnight. It continues to appear in training, in combined arms exercises, and even in regional deployments, including recent activities in the Indo-Pacific where Australian forces demonstrated their ability to project combat power and operate alongside partners such as the Philippines. At the same time, the future is arriving in parallel, not in theory, but in steel and assembly lines, with Australia's Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicle program moving forward at scale, including the rollout of the first Australian-built vehicles as part of a 211-vehicle acquisition designed to replace ASLAV in frontline roles. This creates a moment of overlap that is strategically significant because Australia is not simply swapping one vehicle for another. It is navigating a transition between two different ways of thinking about land warfare, one rooted in mobility and expeditionary flexibility, the other in enhanced protection, digital integration, and long-range lethality. So when we ask whether ASLAV could survive in modern warfare, we are really asking a deeper question that goes to the core of Australia's defense posture. Is survivability about the platform itself, or about how that platform is used within a broader system of sensors, electronic warfare, and precision fires? Because if the rules of the battlefield have changed, then the fate of ASLAV is not just about its armor or its cannon. It is about whether Australia is adapting fast enough to ensure that any platform it fields, old or new, can operate in a battle space where being seen for too long can be as decisive as being hit. To understand whether a platform like ASLAV can remain viable, we have to shift focus away from the vehicle itself and look at what has fundamentally changed around it. Because the defining feature of modern warfare is not a single weapon system, but the speed and density of information flowing across the battlefield. In the past, a reconnaissance vehicle could rely on speed, terrain, and line of sight to manage risk. But today the environment is saturated with low-cost sensors, small unmanned aerial systems, and digital networks that compress the time between detection and response to a level that did not exist when ASLAV was first introduced. Australian defense analysis and recent studies drawn from the conflict in Ukraine point to a battlefield where unmanned systems are no longer a niche capability, but a constant presence, providing persistent observation, rapid target identification, and continuous feedback to commanders, which means that movement itself becomes more visible and therefore more risky if it is not carefully managed. This does not mean that every vehicle is immediately compromised, but it does mean that the margin for error has narrowed significantly, and the penalty for remaining exposed for too long has increased in a way that affects all classes of armored vehicles, not just lighter-wheel platforms. Within this environment, survivability becomes a system-level problem rather than a platform-level attribute, and that is a critical distinction for understanding the position of ASLAV in today's force structure. The Australian Army Research Centre has highlighted that unmanned systems are reshaping how modern land forces operate, and that electronic warfare, while important, is not a complete solution on its own, which reinforces the idea that no single upgrade or feature can guarantee survivability without integration into a broader operational concept. At the same time, the National Defense Strategy emphasizes an integrated force capable of denying adversaries freedom of action, and that requires coordination across sensors, communications, and precision effects rather than reliance on individual platforms acting independently. When these two realities are combined, the question is no longer whether ASLAV is fast enough or whether its armor is sufficient, but whether it can operate as part of a network that detects early, moves intelligently, and limits exposure in a highly contested environment. This is where the tension begins to build, because ASLAV was designed for a different era of reconnaissance, one where mobility and situational awareness were often enough to manage risk, whereas today those same attributes must be paired with digital connectivity, electronic protection, and coordinated fires to remain effective. The battlefield has effectively become more transparent, and that transparency changes the rules of engagement for any platform that relies on movement as a primary defense. For Australia, this is not an abstract lesson. It is a direct challenge tied to its strategic geography, because operating across the Indo-Pacific requires forces that can deploy quickly, operate over long distances, and maintain awareness in complex environments. Yet those same forces must now contend with a level of surveillance and targeting that reduces the advantage of simply being mobile. This creates a dilemma that sits at the heart of the ASLAV question, because the vehicle's strengths have not disappeared, but the environment now demands additional layers of protection and integration that were not part of its original design philosophy. As a result, the discussion naturally shifts from the characteristics of the vehicle to the conditions under which it is used, and whether those conditions can be shaped in a way that allows a platform like ASLAV to continue contributing without being placed at unnecessary risk, setting the stage for a closer examination of what the vehicle actually brings to the fight and where its limits begin to show. At this point, the discussion moves from the battlefield environment back to the machine itself, because to judge its relevance in 2026, it has to be understood on its own terms before it is compared to anything that is replacing it. The Australian Light Armoured Vehicle is a wheeled 8x8 reconnaissance platform weighing just over 13 tons, crewed by 3 soldiers and capable of carrying additional personnel, depending on configuration, with a top road speed close to 100 kilometers per hour and an operational range of roughly 600 kilometers, which gives it a level of mobility that remains valuable across Australia's vast geography and in expeditionary scenarios where distance and response time are critical. Its primary armament is the M242 Bushmaster 25mm cannon, supported by 2 7.62mm machine guns, a combination that was designed to provide sufficient firepower for reconnaissance in force, convoy protection, and limited engagement scenarios rather than sustained high-intensity combat against heavily protected targets. Over its service life, the platform has been progressively upgraded with improved thermal imaging, laser range finding, enhanced driveline systems, run-flat tires, and additional protection features, including measures against improvised explosive devices, which reflects a pattern of incremental adaptation rather than a complete redesign. These characteristics define what ASLAV does well, and those strengths are still relevant in specific contexts, particularly where speed, endurance, and operational familiarity matter more than maximum protection. In Australian service, it has supported cavalry units tasked with reconnaissance, screening, and security roles, often acting as the forward element that gathers information and shapes the battlefield before heavier assets are committed, and that doctrinal role has not disappeared even as the threat environment has evolved. However, the same design choices that made ASLAV effective in earlier decades now define its limits when assessed against modern requirements, because its protection levels are fundamentally constrained by its weight class and original design philosophy, meaning that while it can resist small arms fire and fragmentation, it is not intended to withstand the full spectrum of threats that have become more common in contemporary conflicts, particularly those involving layered surveillance and precision engagement. Its firepower, while versatile, is also bounded by range and effect, with the 25mm system well suited to light targets, but lacking the reach and impact required for engagements against more heavily protected systems at extended distances, a gap that newer platforms are specifically designed to address through integration with advanced sensors and guided munitions. This is where the comparison with the incoming Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicle becomes unavoidable, not as a simple upgrade, but as a shift in capability, because Boxer is built with higher levels of protection, a larger physical footprint, and the capacity to integrate more advanced weapon systems and network sensors, including the ability to operate with anti-armor missiles that extend its engagement envelope significantly beyond what ASLAV was designed to achieve. Yet this comparison introduces a strategic trade-off rather than a clear win, because the increased protection and capability of Boxer come with greater weight and complexity, which can influence how quickly and flexibly it can be deployed, particularly in littoral and dispersed operating environments that are central to Australia's regional focus. This tension is already reflected in professional military analysis within Australia, which has highlighted that heavier platforms can face challenges in rapid deployment scenarios, raising questions about how best to balance survivability with mobility in the specific context of Indo-Pacific operations. As a result, ASLAV occupies a unique position in the present force structure, not as a platform that defines the future, but as one that continues to provide practical utility during a period of transition, offering mobility, familiarity, and a proven operational record, while the Army integrates a new generation of vehicles and adapts its doctrine to match the realities of a more transparent and contested battlefield. What makes this moment particularly important is that the discussion is no longer hypothetical, because throughout 2025 and into early 2026, the Australian Army has continued to operate ASLAV in real training cycles and regional activities, even as its replacement steadily moves from concept into reality. In mid-2025, cavalry units were still conducting live fire training with the 25mm cannon, demonstrating that the platform remains part of the Army's combined arms toolkit rather than a vehicle that has already been withdrawn from meaningful use. And that continuity matters because it shows that the Army is deliberately maintaining capability while transitioning rather than accepting a temporary gap. At the same time, sustainment efforts have remained active, with maintenance crews continuing to carry out major component replacements and ongoing repairs, which reflects both the age of the fleet and the practical decision to keep it operational until the incoming system is fully integrated. This is a critical detail because it reveals that the question of survivability is not only about design, but also about how long a platform can be supported effectively in service, especially when parts, wear, and operational demands begin to converge after decades of use. The regional dimension becomes even clearer during Exercise Alon 25 in the Philippines, where Australia deployed a substantial force package as part of its broader Indo-Pacific engagement, and within that formation, ASLAV still played a role in the cavalry element, contributing to maneuver, reconnaissance, and combined operations alongside artillery and other systems. That deployment is strategically significant because it shows that ASLAV is still considered fit for purpose in scenarios that involve rapid deployment, interoperability with partners, and operations across complex terrain, which are all central to Australia's defense posture in the region. However, running in parallel with these activities is a clear and accelerating shift toward the next generation of capability, and this is where the timeline becomes decisive. By September 2025, the first troop of Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicles was already undergoing operational testing during major exercises, with the Australian Army highlighting improvements in protection, mobility, firepower, and digital connectivity as key advantages over legacy systems. This was not a symbolic milestone, but a practical one, indicating that Boxer was moving beyond acquisition into real operational evaluation. Then in March 2026, a major industrial milestone was reached when the first 7 Boxer vehicles built in Australia rolled off the production line, part of a broader program of 211 vehicles that will ultimately replace ASLAV in frontline roles. This transition is not just about replacing a vehicle, but about reshaping the Army's capability base, linking operational effectiveness with domestic industrial capacity and long-term sustainment. The result is a period of overlap where both platforms exist side by side, one representing proven experience and immediate availability, the other representing future survivability and integration within a more networked force. This overlap creates a sense of urgency that is difficult to ignore because every exercise, every deployment, and every maintenance cycle effectively becomes part of countdown, measuring how long ASLAV can continue to contribute before Boxer fully assumes its role. It is within this window that the real test occurs, not in theory, but in practice, as the Army balances readiness today with transformation for tomorrow. And that balance is what turns a technical comparison into a strategic decision with implications far beyond a single platform. What emerges from this transition is not a simple upgrade path, but a deeper strategic dilemma that sits at the heart of how Australia intends to operate in the Indo-Pacific over the coming decade. Because the choice between platforms like ASLAV and Boxer is ultimately a choice between different operational priorities rather than a clear replacement of inferior with superior. On one side of that equation is survivability, represented by Boxer with its higher protection levels, more advanced sensor integration, and the ability to employ longer-range precision effects, which aligns with the lessons being drawn from contemporary conflicts where exposure without layered protection and networked awareness can quickly erode combat effectiveness. On the other side is deployability, a factor that carries particular weight for Australia, given its geography, its reliance on maritime approaches, and the need to move forces across large distances into dispersed and often austere environments. ASLAV, by virtue of its lighter weight, established logistics footprint, and operational familiarity, still offers advantages in terms of rapid movement, ease of deployment, and flexibility in lower intensity or geographically complex scenarios, particularly those involving littoral zones or regional engagement missions. This tension is not theoretical. It is already being discussed within Australian defense analysis, where concerns have been raised about the challenges of deploying heavier platforms quickly into certain operational theaters, especially when infrastructure, lift capacity, and timelines are constrained. The implication is that a vehicle which is more survivable in a direct engagement may not always be the most practical choice if it cannot arrive in time or operate effectively in the specific conditions that define Australia's strategic environment. This is where the broader intent of the National Defence Strategy becomes critical, because it emphasizes not only the ability to fight, but the ability to deny, to project presence, and to operate in a way that shapes the behavior of potential adversaries before crisis escalates. In that context, the value of a platform is measured not only by its performance under fire, but by its contribution to deterrence, readiness, and regional engagement. ASLAV, despite its limitations, still contributes to that equation by enabling cavalry units to maintain a visible, mobile, and responsive presence, while Boxer is being positioned to take on the more demanding roles that require greater protection and integration within a networked force. The challenge for Australia is ensuring that this transition does not create a gap between those two capabilities, where the older system is no longer fully adequate and the newer system is not yet fully embedded. That requires careful sequencing, sustained investment in training and doctrine, and a clear understanding that survivability in modern warfare is as much about how forces are employed as it is about the equipment they carry. It also requires recognizing that no single platform can solve the problem on its own, because the battlefield that has emerged in recent years rewards those who can combine mobility, protection, information, and coordination into a coherent operational approach. In this light, the question of whether ASLAV can survive becomes part of a much larger question about whether Australia can balance speed with resilience, reach with protection, and immediate readiness with long-term transformation. And it is this balance that will ultimately determine how effectively the Australian Army can operate in a region that is becoming more contested, more complex, and less forgiving of outdated assumptions. By the time we reach this point, the answer is no longer confined to a single platform, because what has been unfolding across 2025 and into 2026 is a broader transformation of how Australia prepares for and thinks about land warfare in a far more contested Indo-Pacific environment. The continued presence of ASLAV alongside the steady introduction of Boxer is not a contradiction, but a reflection of a deliberate transition, where capability is preserved in the short term, while a more resilient and integrated force is built for the future. The rollout of Australian-built Boxer vehicles, beginning with the first 7 units completed in early 2026 as part of a total program of 211, signals that this transition has moved beyond planning into execution, tying operational capability directly to domestic industrial capacity and long-term sustainment. At the same time, exercises such as Alon 25 demonstrate that Australia cannot afford to wait for a perfect future force before maintaining a credible presence in the region. And that means legacy systems like ASLAV continue to play a role in enabling mobility, reconnaissance, and engagement with regional partners. This dual-track approach highlights a key strategic insight, which is that readiness today and transformation for tomorrow must occur simultaneously rather than sequentially. However, the deeper lesson that emerges from recent analysis and operational experience is that survivability in modern warfare is not determined by armor thickness alone, nor by the age of a platform, but by how effectively that platform is integrated into a system that combines sensors, communications, electronic warfare, and precision effects. In such a system, a vehicle that moves intelligently, remains connected, and limits its exposure can remain relevant, even if it was not originally designed for today's threat environment. While a more advanced platform can still face challenges if it is employed without the necessary supporting structure. This reframes the original question in a way that is far more useful for understanding Australia's strategic trajectory, because the issue is not whether ASLAV can survive in isolation, but whether the Australian Army can operate in a way that maximizes the survivability of all its assets, regardless of generation. Within the context of a national defense strategy, this becomes a question of deterrence and denial, where the goal is not simply to endure, but to shape the environment so that potential adversaries are constrained before conflict escalates. That requires a force that can deploy quickly, operate across dispersed locations, maintain awareness in complex terrain, and integrate seamlessly with allies and partners, all while adapting to the increasing transparency of the modern battlefield. In this sense, ASLAV serves as a bridge between two eras, a platform that embodies the strengths of mobility and familiarity while exposing the limits of a design that predates the current wave of technological change. The arrival of Boxer does not close that chapter overnight, but it does accelerate the shift toward a force that is more protected, more connected, and more capable of operating within a networked battle space. The final insight is therefore not about declaring one vehicle obsolete and another superior, but about recognizing that the decisive factor in modern warfare is the speed at which a military can adapt its concepts, integrate new technologies, and align its capabilities with its strategic objectives. For Australia, the question that will matter most in the years ahead is not whether a single platform can survive, but whether the force as a whole can evolve quickly enough to remain credible, responsive, and effective in a region that is becoming increasingly contested and strategically significant.